Good morning to everybody here in Washington, afternoon to those in Europe, and evening to those in Syria or the broader Middle East. We have an excellent Washington Institute Policy Forum today. It's been almost 3 months since the fall of the Assad regime, which is still hard to believe, but the future of the country remains delicate. Syria is still not whole. Turkey and its proxies continue to attack US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces that are continuing to fight the Islamic State. Israel continues airstrikes on former regime military sites and makes incursions into southern Syria. The new government in Damascus and the SDF continue to negotiate over how it might integrate into the new Syrian military, as well as issues related to the borders, energy security, and preserving Kurdish rights. Damascus is also continuing to fight against remnants of the Assad regime, Hezbollah, and the IRGC, as well as their Captagon and weapons smuggling networks. The new Syrian government is also attempting to consolidate security and governance in the areas that it controls, while also running a transition process that has many locally and internationally wanting to see it fail. It is also not doing itself any favors over its process or setting expectations related to the transition, even if the messaging is relatively good. This all comes in the context of a country that has a 90% poverty rate, 1/3 of its buildings are destroyed or hollowed out, and the capital only gets about 1 hour of electricity every day. Continued sanctions are suffocating the ability of a new Syria to recover. Whatever one thinks of the new government, there are many challenges. If I told you 3 months ago, however, that Syria would be relatively stable, does not have a policy of retribution, and is a government seeking to work with the international community, including the West, and going after traditional adversaries such as jihadis or Iran's axis of resistance, one would be hopeful and see this as an opportunity, not as a threat. Yet many barriers remain in Washington to either seriously engage the new authorities to better advise the transition process in a manner more amenable to U.S. interests, especially as it relates to inclusivity, or if it does not want to have a forward-leaning policy approach, at least allow American allies and partners in Europe, the Gulf states, and Turkey space to provide avenues for Syria to succeed and not impede things based on sanctions that were crafted for the former Assad regime, not the new government. Because if Syria fails, it will not follow Vegas rules. Just like a decade ago, problems emanating from Syria will not just stay in Syria. It'll affect neighboring allied countries, including Israel, as well as consequences in the West related to potentially greater refugee flows and a reanimated Islamic State threat. And to discuss these various dynamics, we have an excellent panel today. Following their remarks, I'll ask some questions and then see if there are any in the audience. If you have any, for those on the Zoom, please add them to the Q&A chat function. But if you're just watching it over the live stream, you can send an email to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org to ask any of these. Each speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes to speak on various issues. Our first speaker is Gregory Waters. He's a researcher at the Syrian Archive and a former consultant with the International Crisis Group. His work has focused on the Assad regime security services and more recently local governance after the Assad regime's fall. He also recently spent 6 weeks in Syria doing field research. So this is fresh information and we're really looking forward to it. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Aaron, for hosting this event and having me on. So I guess as an introduction, I'll just briefly talk about the minority issue, as we could call it, in Syria post-Assad. I think one of the most important base things to understand is that relations between the new government and minorities in Syria is not homogeneous. It differs by geography and by sect across the country. So, for example, if we look at the Ismaili community, they generally across the board have very good relations with local officials and even with the central government. But even within that, you see a stronger relationship, a closer relationship in places like Salamiyya because the Ismaili community is stronger there and their institutions are stronger. And whereas if you look at a place like Tartus, the Ismaili community is so small that while they have a good relations with the government, they're not as maybe as actively involved in local administration, service provision, conflict resolution as you would see in Salamiyya. When it comes to the Christians, it's similar, maybe not quite as good. The relations seem to be more varied, especially when it comes to Christian relations with their neighbors, with non-government, non-Christian neighbors. But I think it's important to highlight that within the first days of the fall of Assad, one of the first things we saw was across the country, local officials, returned opposition commanders, locals, that were already there. One of the first things they did was host meetings with neighboring Christian leaders. And I think, this really saw sort of the end result of that 6 years of policy change from HTS in Idlib, where they began to engage with the Christians in Idlib going back to 2018 to try and right the wrongs, the violations that community had faced and endured over the 10 years of fighting in the region. And that shift in sort of HTS posture towards religious minorities, and particularly Christians, is now we've seen carry over into the rest of Syria and the rest of the community, where there's a clear, sign of that there shouldn't be issues with this community here. So where you do see issues is more related to local dynamics, politics of individuals. And that's just to say that Alawites are really, when we look at religious sects, it's the Alawite community where we see by far the most tensions and potential crisis points going forward. That being said, all of us, like you mentioned, Aaron, on December 8th, the two big fears were this sort of de-Baathification of the government and security forces and mass retribution attacks against Alawites. On the former, most of the ministries remain majority regime era employees, just by the nature of the new government not having the human resources to staff them up. And of those, most are still Alawite. So we absolutely have not seen a system of, de-Baathification of Alawites from civil government. This ongoing, firing and laying off temporary leave of employees in the different ministries when it comes to the health and education sector, that is, even Alawites will tell you, that's not being done on a sectarian basis. It's being done by clear set of criteria regarding employment statuses and how you were hired. Of course, it will impact Alawites more than others because of the nature of how the regime was and how these positions were staffed. But it's not there's no signs of a sort of policy of disenfranchising Alawites from civil government. Of course, the army was fired en masse, but again, that includes Sunnis, Ismaili, Shia. Everyone was let go from security forces. And again, because Alawites were so many Alawites served in these positions, there's a perception of an undue impact on the Alawite community from these decisions. But again, there was not this policy of targeting them. And then when it comes to security, yes, there have been crimes. I don't think anyone should expect there not to be crimes, whether that's retribution, revenge attacks from civilians, or we saw in Western Homes last month or January with the security operations that result in men being executed or killed in firefights. These happened, but there had, the fears that everyone had, including Alawites, and they'll be the first to tell you the mass killings that we expected never came. Now, despite all of that, the fear in the coast, and I just came back from 2 weeks in Latakia and Tartus, and the fear is overwhelming. And in early December, that fear was really rooted in what was happening on the ground. There are suddenly these masked armed men in your towns. 2 days ago, you were told these men were coming to ethnically cleanse everyone, and now they're here. And there's just sort of waiting for something to happen. But nothing happened. And now those men have been withdrawn. The army, the DMO forces are back in their bases. The foreign fighters were all taken out of the coast. They're all back in bases in Idlib. All you see in the coast are uniformed police and general security. And occasionally you'll have DMO guys come out of their base and man a checkpoint for, they're looking for someone and for doing raids. Now the fears are really more existential. It's this insistent belief that, yes, nothing's happened yet, but in 4 months, 5 months, 1 year, we're waiting for that ethnic cleansing to come. We're waiting for once a new government forms, then they're going to come and attack us, come and remove Alawites from the Syrian equation. There's this deep fear that the Alawite community there's no plans for the Alawite community to be part of future Syria. And a lot of that, there's the security aspect, but a lot of it's rooted in economics and livelihood. And this perception, with the economic conditions being so bad in Syria, there's this perception that they are particularly bad in the Alawite areas, and that perhaps investment is happening in Sunni areas and intentionally not happening in Alawite areas. which I did not find to be the case. And I'd be curious if anyone thinks differently, but from what I saw, everyone is impoverished. There is no investment anywhere, and a lot of this has to do with the sanctions. But there's definitely this perception of being specifically targeted, that all of it builds up to this fear of being left out of future Syria. And I think I'll leave it there. We can go into a little bit more like the intercommunal aspects of this. I think there's a lot of really big concerns to be had with how the coastal communities have become even more insular post-Assad, and what this means for future interfaith, intercommunal efforts. But I'll leave it at that overview and let you move on.
Great. Thank you so much. Those are great opening remarks. Second, we have Sausan Abu Zainuddin, who's the CEO of Madaniya, an independent initiative that brings together more than 200 Syrian civil society organizations with the goal of reclaiming the political agency of the country's civic space. She also recently was involved in the National Dialogue Conference too, so she has some ground insights from being in the country as well. Thank you for your comments, Sausan.
Thanks, Aaron, and hello to everyone. I'd like to start from where Gregory ended, in a way, to also highlight that I think what defines this phase in the history of Syria is a lack of clarity, despite the promising hope that everyone upholds. And despite the great effort that I think everyone across the spectrum, regardless of as Syrians at least, regardless of their positionality within the government, outside the government, within the civic space, outside the civic space, a lot of effort are being invested to make sure that the transition does not fail. So it's not a matter of aligning or positioning oneself with or against. It's a matter of investing all efforts so that this transition does not fail, because failure is not in the interest of anybody, not in the interest of any of the Syrians, not in the interest of the region, and not in the interest of the global order. And unfortunately, as you said, Aaron, earlier, the situation is still very delicate. It's also very fragile to an extent that imbalance could really lead to significant unfortunate events. And Gregory touched base upon some of these things. Yes, I think all of us are now looking at the situation in comparison to our worst case scenario that we've expected upon the fall of the Assad regime. The fact that the worst case scenario for the fall of the regime did not take place is giving everybody hope and will to invest in making this transition succeed. But fear is still in place, and the lack of clarity, the lack of process and procedures that we would often hope to see in a political transition is only contributing to making the situation more delicate and more fragile. So I was asked to focus on Sueda, on the southern region where I'm originally from, and I think the fragility that we're talking about is pretty much reflected in that region. I would say there's some sort of a division that we could see in the region between two different groups. One of them, the division is mostly reflected within the armed groups of Sueda, to a certain extent also within the community leaders, amongst the community leaders, particularly the religious ones, and then maybe to a lesser extent actually within the civic space. Now, we know that even before the fall of the regime, Sueda, for the past couple of years, maintained a very active Hirak and movement against the Assad regime. It was one of the few, if not the only, regime-held area that has continuously demonstrated against the regime, referred to Resolution 2254, calling for a political transition, etc. And the religious leaders, particularly Sheikh al-Hajari, played a very crucial part in sustaining this Hirak in Sueda and ensuring that there is no communal division around that, and this in a way has contributed to safeguarding Sueda upon the fall of the Assad regime. Now, after the fall, with the lack of clarity on the process for the political transition, we started to see this division manifesting more and more amongst some of those community leaders, and the lack of position today from Sheikh Hikmat al-Hajari, for example, when it comes to the Israeli statements. The Israeli invasion is only raising more questions about what is the situation in this region. It's also reflected amongst some of the armed groups. I think the main contentious issue in here is whether whether the people in Sueda, the systems, the structures in Sueda do submit to the central government today as is, with all the lack of clarity, or they withhold power and arms and autonomy until they see more clarity in terms of the process. So until there is a clear constitutional declaration that kind of frames the direction that the central government is going to take, until there's a transitional government in place, the ministers are named, and then there's more clarity on the inclusivity that the current leadership in Damascus aspires for. And until then, I think from within the civic space, we've seen this division manifesting in a way, where some would say we are part of a whole Syria, and whatever applies to the country as a whole apply to us as citizens in this country, whereas there remains a fewer segments within the civic space who are taking the position of the religious leaders and some of the armed groups who still want to see more clarity on the political front before they actually move forward in a more collaborative way towards the central authority. So I think the situation in Sueda also reflects to assert that there's no I would say there's no kind of special situation that's taking place in Sueda. I think it's only a manifestation of the lack of clarity on the bigger picture, but it's maybe reflecting more practically in the region because of the Israeli invasion, because the region has been under immediate threat by the statements of the Israeli Prime Minister and the expansion of the Israeli troops in Daraa all the way towards Sueda. So we started seeing more questions about, a scheme that's being planned that goes all the way from Al Jazeera, from the northern and eastern parts of Syria, through Al Badi, going through Sueda, Daraa, Qneitra, where Israel wants to keep a buffer zone because of to protect themselves, given the lack of trust with the new authorities. So these statements, I think that the rise of these statements and the lack of response or the lack of positions from some of the community leaders in Sueda with regards to these schemes have made questions more prominent, and have maybe made the division in Sueda more clear in comparison to other regions in Syria. But I would say it's we're all eyes on the next steps. We're awaiting a constitutional declaration and the formation of a transitional government, and I think these two milestones are capable of reassuring many segments in Sueda, but also in the wider Syrian communities, and only then I think we can be more certain of what direction this country is heading towards in terms of its territorial integration or not. I'll stop here. We can maybe come back to unpack some of these elements later.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was great. Next up is Farhad Ahmad. He is the co-founder and director of PEL Civil Waves, a peace-building organization in Syria. And he'll be looking at some of the issues currently going on related to Northeast Syria, as well as the dynamic of the Kurds. Farhad, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Aaron, and thank you for hosting this very interesting event and for inviting me to join it. So actually, as the most people of Syria, also the people of northeastern Syria, were very happy about the fall of the Assad regime. It was also for them an historical moment because generations of Syrians, including the people of northeastern Syria, including Kurds, Assyrians, other minorities, they have been fighting and waiting for this moment for generations and for decades. They saw in this moment also like an opportunity to address historical and deep-rooted problems with Damascus, with the central government, and also a chance maybe to reintegrate the region into the country, but not for free, should be on clear foundations that address Kurdish demands, but also those demands of other populations group. The people of the northeastern Syria do not want to remain also in the next future, the next decades, remain marginalized and excluded from the decision making and the administration of the country. They would like to see themselves as also citizens of Syria and won't be also part of the management of issues related to the ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity of the region. They would like to see a government in Damascus that address all those issues and take in consideration that Syria is a country that consists of different ethnic, religious, and social groups. Nowadays, like after around 3 months, to be honest, the people of northeastern Syria, they feel a high level of uncertainty about the future. They are not sure if they will have a real good future and they will be integrated on the basis of the principles I mentioned before. So there are, for example, still no clear results from the negotiations between the SDF, so the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the government of Damascus on one hand. And on the other hand, the Damascus government, it should be like a transitional government, is proceeding with implementing many major steps without real and deep consultations with representatives of the people of northeastern Syria and also the rest of the people of Syria. So the HDS or the government in Damascus, for example, immediately began to act as a government with full powers and not as transitional government. This gave actually the feeling to the people of northeastern Syria that they are now starting to deal with behavior that they know from former government of Syria or even from the Assad regime. So the government in Damascus, for example, started to hold a national dialogue conference to organize it, to prepare it without consulting people of northeastern Syria, without also starting a real process how to organize and how to design this very important step, this national dialogue conference. Maybe one of the characteristics of the Kurds specifically in Northeast, but also in general, actually in North Syria is Kurds want always to be seen as a group, not as individuals. Therefore, the majority of the Kurds would like to be invited as a group and would like to be represented by Kurdish political powers and parties. It should be the parties included in the self-administration, but also the National Council, Kurdish National Council, and all other parties. And this characteristic has not been seen till now, actually, by the government in Damascus, still trying to invite Kurds as individuals to participate in this process, to participate in the National Dialogue Conference, but also in another meetings to represent the Kurds. And this policy will not actually bring real results because we have several other experiences from the past also. Kurds were always seeing in the political parties as their representatives, not in individuals. So, and this trend actually to act as a real government with full power was even seen in the presidential speech of Ahmad al-Shara, for example, regarding the nature of the new Syrian political system. He mentioned that the new presidential system should be a presidential one. The new system should be a presidential and centralized system. Without even waiting for the results of the debates of transitional phase, and also without waiting for the results of the negotiation with SDF and with other political parties. This, and as you also mentioned, Aaron, at the beginning, the still ongoing fighting against SDF from Turkish proxies, from the Syrian National Army and all the allied groups are giving actually less hope to the people of northeastern Syria that the future, the new future, is promising real change in their life and in their position inside the new Syria. So if the government in Damascus will continue act with the people of northeastern Syria in this way, that this will send them a clear message that we are not going to have an inclusive process, but also not have an inclusive Syria. And it means also we will have a lot of issues and problems to focus and to address and to deal with it in the future. This was like just an overview of the how the people in northeastern Syria are now seeing the developments inside Syria. We can also talk about the negotiations between SDF and the government in Damascus, how they are going now and which topics they are discussing. But I will leave it now for the audience to ask if they are interested in this topic as well. Thank you.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much, Farhad. We'll definitely touch upon those negotiations in the Q&A for sure. Last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Rahaf Al-Dughli. She's a lecturer in the Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University. She's also author of the book Romanticizing Masculinity in Ba'athist Syria, Gender Identity and Ideology, and has recently been in Syria as well, doing field research and looking at issues related to the different military structures that were going on before the regime fell, related to HTS, the SNA, and others. So looking forward to hearing more about this.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thanks for inviting me. And I would like also to thank all the great speakers before me, which to a large extent, I do agree with everything that's said, but I'm gonna focus on the military landscape. And also, actually, I wanted also to start with something that I was about to conclude with, which is, and I'm starting with this because I sense that there is lots of focus on the lack of trust, transparency, and maybe representation in this transitional era surrounding Syria. I think there are some of the issues that within this kind of political transitioning era that we have, the lack of trust in the new leadership, and also there is a pattern of lack of transparency and also meaningful, inclusive kind of dialogue. When it comes, this is actually when not only when it comes to minorities or certain kind of ethnic groups within Syria or communities, but it can be also applied that we see this pattern also in the way that the military integration happened. When we go about the reality of the current military integration in post-Assad Syria, we see that al-Shara, there is actually Syria's future depends to a large extent on the need for central authority against the grievances of its many factions. So that integration happened in a very, while it looks in a very smooth way after the victory speech in January 29th in like few weeks ago. However, we see that there is more of a complexity in terms of the regional intervention of that. There is a regional dynamic regarding these armed factions that's involved in leading this transitional phase. For example, SNA groups are still, till that last month, they are still getting their salaries from Turkey. They are not paid by the MOD, which means that they are still might be used in the future as a proxy against SDF. Also, I want to add to that generally speaking, again, I want to stress it's not only about minority groups or certain groups in Syria that they feel that they don't have that big trust or real representations by the current leadership. However, also in terms of the military landscape, where many fighters and central commanders expressed deep-seated grievances and lack of trust in the new leadership. And this is because of the MOD, or the Ministry of Defense, actually approached this integration in a very hierarchical way, or based on the recent appointments that we saw in the Military of Defense were more based on loyalty and not on professionalism. And also there is a regional elements that might complicate the transitional phase in the future, where we have two foreigners that are listed in Jordan and in Turkey in top positions in the army. This again might complicate things in Syria future. Another quite a challenge waiting al-Sharia, and let's not forget that there was the al-Sharia was pragmatic and smart in a way that he hinged and capitalized on the revolutionary spirit after the 8th of December, where many, even those who lack trust in al-Sharia from the SNA commanders, they said, we don't want to look as if we are traitors and we are popular in terms of how people will perceive them if they challenge al-Sharia call for dissolving their armed factions. But this does not mean that they are still that the integration happened. So even if there are another 14 central commanders within SNA, till now they have not officially integrated in the Ministry of Defense. This is one aspect. Another aspect that, in terms of the concerns shared with me by SNA commanders and also SDF commanders, when it comes to SNA, there is lack of clear transitional justice. Most of these SNA commanders fear that in the future they might get persecuted by al-Sharia. Another concern is that related to real representations, and this is, for example, they even SDF and if in my conversation with commanders from the southern factions, they did propose somehow that the Ministry of Defense establish a representative military council, where that this kind of the integration happens through this military council, where SDF, for example, SDF is represented with 2 commanders and SNA is represented with the 3 commanders. This is a way that where these military or armed factions don't feel that they have been isolated, and that integration happens in a hierarchical or in a top-down approach. I want to actually also mention that the lack of trust in terms of SDF and the Israeli intervention in the south or attacks on the south has further fractured actually or complicated the process of integrating these armed factions. Because of this external threat, we see that those grievances among SNA factions or ex-regime, and as what Gregory mentioned earlier about the violations against Alawites or ex-regime's followers, all of these actually lead to might be a potential emergence of spoilers and external actors involved in a very manipulative way, where they can treat these kind of dissatisfied actors in a way to further violate and fracture this kind of transitional phase or the real integration. What I want to finish with is that a meaningful, I have not seen till now a meaningful inclusivity or a meaningful building trust initiatives from the new leadership. And I think focusing or pressuring on having these 3 like achieving or this kind of building trust, transparency, and representation, and also clear communications about these, for example, the form of transitional justice that will be taken or adopted, and also how these appointments are made is really essential and important for the next phase of Syria. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. These were excellent presentations to start things off. I have a question for all the different panelists before we kick it to the audience, if there are any. I'll start again with Greg, sort of continuing with that ending thread related to what Rahaf just said, as well related to spoilers and maybe touching upon some of the stuff that we've been seeing in the coast related to more attacks on security checkpoints. What's your view on this Syrian national resistance or coastal shield? Is this just spontaneous? This is ex-regime? Is there any like remnant IRGC, like Hezbollah involved in any of this? Like, can you explain who these people are and more about that possibly?
Yeah, of course. I think it's really hard to know the specifics of just how organized it is. There's certainly been lots of different claims from different sides. If you talk with Sunnis in the coast, they will say that IRGC is involved in supporting these insurgents in some way. There's reporting from more of the Turkish outlets recently that a lot of this is being organized via ex-regime and Iran elements based out of the Northeast or Iraq. But I think what I can say for certain is that there are networks of ex-regime security forces, al-Shabiha, that are organized via these so-called religious sheikhs that exist in the coast. And I think it's really important that, especially for foreign officials who are engaging with or trying to find representatives of the Alawite sect to hear from, to understand what the Alawite religious sheikhs are. I mean, and this is as described by Alawites in the coast. They are sort of the last remnants of the regime. They're that last vestige of the regime itself. They were appointed by the regime to control these communities. A lot of them were former soldiers, former officers with bad reputations, get fired, go home, and reinvent themselves as intellectual men. We saw this with Salah Mansour, who was briefly famous back in December, and then with Basel Khatib this month. These are not men who represent Alawites. They represent a specific cohort. These ex-regime insurgents, or maybe not insurgents yet, but people who are against the new government. I met with one of these sheikhs, and he explicitly threatened an armed insurgency if our demands are not met. But it's very clear that from them, they don't want Alawite engagement with the government. They want themselves to be empowered by government, because there is Alawite engagement at the local level. Alawite civil society is being engaged, is being listened to, is working closely with local administrators. All of the regime era, you call them mayors and municipal councils, still exist, and they function alongside underneath HTS appointed regional directors. So it is not a case where Alawites have no voice, but for these networks, they want to have the power, right? So they absolutely exist, and they see, that violence as a tool both to destabilize the area. I think there's a hope of triggering more heavy-handed backlash from HTS that then blows up on the international stage, like we see with how Israel responds to what's happened in Jarmana and Sueda. I hope that you have that there's a continual begging for international interventions from some of these figures of U.S. military forces coming in or foreign European forces coming in. So that there's a clear strategy here to stir up conflict that gets seen on the international stage and has this international backlash. I think when we see these executions of the 2 Ismaili men in Kadmus by local Alawites, there's also potentially this attempt to cause more sectarian strife between the other minority communities and HTS. They don't think that attack was not successful because Ismailis, like I said, have a very good relations with HTS, but I think this is also somewhere we could go. We could see more risk going forward.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to Sosan. As I said at the beginning, you took part in the National Dialogue Conference that happened now about 2 weeks ago, I guess. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the process of the new government being in touch, um, what actually went down beyond just how they communicated the actual national dialogue, as well as the different committee meetings, because I think there was like 6 different committee meetings, and how you felt that process went, and sort of where you hope to see things move, or what they could potentially learn from this experience to try and improve the process better going forward, because it seemed, at least from the outside, that it was kind of rushed in some manner.
Sure. Well, not just from the outside. I think it was rushed and on so many levels, the entire process. Again, so I want to start by highlighting that I understand that it's again a very sensitive, fragile, delicate phase that we're going through, with so many interest groups, with sometimes contentious interests, not just different interests, but sometimes really conflicting and contentious interests. We're talking about radicals, jihadis, we're talking about civil society actors, human rights defenders, we're talking about regional countries and regional powers, and we're talking about international actors, and we're talking about ordinary Syrian citizens who just want to see, a life that is that upholds dignity and freedoms on the basic levels, but most importantly, good economic welfare system on one way. So the restoration of services, etc. And I understand that legitimizing this transition has been rushed on so many aspects, and establishing the National Dialogue Conference in the way it was established can only be seen as part of this wider kind of dynamic or trend. But it was rushed. The actual day of dialogue was preceded by multiple consultation sessions, which themselves have seen flaws on so many levels. Farhad touched based upon some of these in the Northeast, in particular, given the tensions between the SDF forces and the central authorities in Damascus, which contributed to different arrangements for including certain people in these consultations. But also, widely speaking, nobody was invited as a representative of an entity, not of a political party, not of a civil society entity, etc. Back to Farhad's point, I think the authorities are dealing with individuals. They're taking into account their affiliations, their positions, their etc. But no one has been engaged on the basis of their, representation to a certain political or non-political entities, and that's a point of discussion. I mean, I'm not going to get into, whether it should have been done otherwise. I think it's a point of discussion given the complexity of the Syrian context prior to this point. And then the day of dialogue came. So in terms of process, there was 6 main thematic groups, and these thematic groups were identified based on these national consultations that took place in the month ahead of the day of dialogue. And then participants were split into 16 working groups. So each thematic group was discussed by multiple working group. The conversations started from with working documents that were submitted given to us by the preparatory committee, and I believe that these working documents were very brief. They were the summary of the consultations that took place ahead of the dialogue with regards to the particular theme that is being discussed. But participants were given all the space to negate these points and to start from scratch, or to take them on board and to deliberate and to develop them further. So the 6 main thematic groups were the constitution, the state institutions, the role of the civil society organizations, the economic principles, transitional justice, and personal freedoms and the political life. I personally was in the group that discussed the role of the civil society, although we've agreed that this is not a relevant title. The main theme that was actually the substance that was discussed was civic space and the protection of the civic space and the independence of a civic space and the relation between the civic space and the authority in a ways that can safeguard a political, not just a political transition, but also the future of the country that we aspire for, starting from the constitution and the constitutional declaration, which needs to uphold certain rights, right to assembly, right to freedom of expression, right to organize, right to establish political parties, right to establish civil society organizations. So all the rights that needs to be protected in the constitution, all the way to the laws that and procedures that would govern the relation between actors in the civic space and the authority itself. After the discussion, the facilitators came back. So I'm explaining the process for the sake of transparency for everyone, because I know that the process lacked transparency on so many levels. But so after at the end of the deliberations within each group, participants were handed the final statement that would summarize the agreements among the different. So, for example, for my thematic group, we were 3 working groups, and the facilitators of the 3 working groups came together, looked at the different points, and came together with one document that supposedly summarizes the agreements. And to be honest, the document that was handed to us was very good. It honestly and genuinely reflected the conversations that took place, and it was promised that all of these detailed deliberations will be put together in one big report that that would be presented to the Syrian public and will be accessible to everyone, to shed light on the agreements and disagreements when it comes to all of the points. So in terms of a 1 day of dialogue, I think it was a very good 1 day of dialogue. However, the concluding statement does reflect the complexity that we're facing at this point. The multiple keywords for me were missing from the concluding remarks, including, for example, democracy, a peaceful transition of power, so many other elements that we would hope to find in a final declaration of a national dialogue on such a level were missing. But these were missed because they were actually points of discussion, of disagreement in the different multiple groups. So they had to be taken out so that the concluding remarks reflect some sort of an agreement. And if this says anything, it says that the national dialogue to establish the political future of Syria cannot in any way be reduced to 1 day of dialogue. We've seen the amount of disagreements. We're talking about real disagreements on substance related to democracy, to freedoms, to rights, and we've seen a process that in a way excluded certain people who felt uninvited and unrepresented in this process. So if this says anything, it says that we cannot settle for this as a national dialogue conference, but there needs to be a more systematic process, a longer process for dialogue that could last for months, if not years, to feed into this transitional phase, and where dialogue could really be practiced in a genuine way that can come up with points of agreement to form the constitution and other main elements in this transition. And this in itself was a very important point of discussion that at least was discussed heavily in my working group, but also in the other working groups and other thematic groups, as I've heard from other participants. And it was one of the points that was agreed upon in the final document that was submitted to us. So we're all eyes now on this technical detailed report that will be made available and accessible to everyone to list this, and it will have to say clearly, if it's an honest report, that there needs to be a more systematic process of dialogue, so that so that we could say that the future of Syria was kind of framed as a result of an extensive dialogue. I'll stop here.
Great. No, that was definitely very helpful and more than I've heard publicly on this issue. So this will definitely be useful for anybody listening. Farhad, turning back to you, I know that you discussed the potential of the current negotiations going on between the SDF and Ahmed Ashara, as well as anybody else involved in that. I was wondering if maybe for a few minutes you could discuss some of these issues.
Yes. I mean, what Sausan described is actually somehow the content of the negotiation between SDF and Ahmad Ashara or HTS government. So the design of the process is one of the main issues and the problems also in the negotiation between SDF and HTS government. We have main challenges related to these negotiations. Maybe we can talk at the first level about challenges related to the negotiations parties themselves, so HTS and SDF. So they have clearly different concepts about the purpose of the negotiations and also the timetable required to implement the negotiation results. So each one is actually coming with own plan, with own ideas, and those ideas are not actually going in the same line and the same direction. For example, HTS is seeing in this a process toward the dissolution of the Syrian Democratic Forces and their immediate integration to the Syrian army. They are also wishing to recontrol of the oil fields and border crossings as a primary goal of the negotiation, and setting a very short timetable to reach all those results. This includes should consist of 2 to 3 weeks at the beginning, so as they began with the negotiation in early January 25. So this time is behind us, and it shows how unrealistic actually HTS was coming to the negotiation and how the design of this process was actually not related to the realities. Also, Sharia, but also the HTS in general, doesn't like details. So that's actually people participating in the negotiation telling us they don't like details. They are only focusing on reaching like a kind of leader-to-leader agreement, Muslim Abdi to Al-Shara, and prefer to don't, for example, build thematical groups to discuss about different issues like education, for example, ethnic rights, and also political system, administrative system, and all other issues which are very important to the Kurds, but also to the rest of the people of northeastern Syria. On the other hand, the SDF, the self-administration, are seeing this negotiation as a political transformation process, or at least hoping that this should be a political transformation process. So in this regard, the future of the SDF should be one of the most maybe important and crucial negotiations topics, but not the only topic as HTS currently wishes. SDF sees themselves, this military group, as a guarantee for the political demands of the people of northeastern Syria, for the Kurds, but also for other groups. And we have also clear differences in perceptions about the form of the state system, specifically about decentralization and the amount of decentralization. We had also seen in the speech of Ahmad Ashara, for example, that he talked about the coming political system in Syria and describing it as a centralized political system, which is actually somehow disappointing the people in northeastern Syria, disappointing the Kurds, but also other minorities, because if you would like actually design a clear transitional process and include all the people, you have to wait for the results of this transitional process, and then define actually the political and the administrative system of the country. What we are seeing is actually, on one hand, designing a different system, and on the other hand, talking to the SDF just for like a clear goal to integrate the SDF as a military power in the new Syrian army without accepting the political demands of the SDF, of the Serb administration, or also other Kurdish political parties. We have also other challenges related to external forces, just like two sentences. As we also mentioned in the beginning, Turkey is still exerting great military pressure on the SDF. The fighting near the Tishrin Dam are still going on, and Turkey is always and still trying to occupy other areas of northeastern Syria, including Kobani, maybe also other parts, for example, even Raqqa and other areas. We have also to see a very important relation between the negotiation between Turkey and the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan and its impact on the situation in northeastern Syria. So just like to don't open the Pandora box and to go too far from the situation in Syria, there only one actually negotiation round happened till now. Currently, there are some talks to organize the next round between Ahmad Ishara and Mazloum Kobani, but still, we don't have actually a sign that this round will take place in the next few days. So people are waiting and hoping that this negotiation will lead actually to some change in the behavior of the government, but those hopes are very limited actually comparing with the behavior of the government in Damascus in the last 3 months. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We only have 4 minutes left, so we're short on time, but I wanted to kick it to Raha for one last question related to, you previously have done work and wrote a book about gender dynamics and masculinity, about the Assad regime and Baathism. How does that relate to what we see now with the new government, and whether there's similarities or differences? I know that we only have a few minutes, so it's a lot to cram in, but at least some initial thoughts.
No worries. It took me 4 days to unpack the new emergence of masculinity in the new Syria. It took me 4 days actually, and I was commissioned to write a piece on masculinity in post-Assad Syria. And well, in just short, it's a total different masculinity and gender dynamics we see, like from pre-Assad fall. We see from hyper masculinity, very kind of clear in the streets with the presence of Hafez al-Assad statues, to complete destruction of these old or post very hegemonic masculine stages, however, to the emergence of masked men, which is essential and important, and it does bring me back to the military landscape. Actually, I did the field work to ask why the security men are masked. And I got the answers, which will come out in a piece soon, about partially to instill fear and intimidation, and because of the lack of number of security men on the ground. So this new masculinity does reflect about the fragility of security institutions in Syria. I will end here. Even less than
that was very succinct, so I appreciate that. I think one of the things we could learn from this policy forum essentially is that things aren't as bad or compared to how many suspected it might be when the regime fell, especially from a group of people that originally were HTS, considering their past associations. But things still remain fragile even 3 months later. I think a lot of people locally, as well as in international governments, would prefer that there be a bit more transparency in explaining why they're doing certain actions, and maybe messaging that ahead of time so that there's expectations of the local population and internationally. And that unfortunately, because of these dynamics, there are increasing spoilers that are coming about, whether it is remnants of the regime or continued Turkish and Israeli actions in the north, in the south of the country. And because of that, even though there was this huge euphoria after the fall of the regime now, this transition process is going to be even more difficult with all of these challenges. even if I think everybody in this panel, as well as many people that are supporters of Syria, want it to succeed. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I just want to thank those on the panel again for your excellent insights. And thank you everybody for watching online, and see you soon. Thank you again.